Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 12th Annual PPP Building Resilience Conference, our final day. At this time, we ask you to please make your way from the briefing center to the Great Hall so that we may begin the program promptly. Please take your seats.
Hey, good morning. I hope that everyone had a cup of coffee or two. I know that there's still people out in the briefing center or the Resilience Lounge or the third place, however it's called during this conference. Really want to appreciate everyone being here today. Certainly want to thank those that are sponsoring or partnering with us. You can see their logos on the side screens and probably the screen behind me. I really hope that you had an opportunity to meet old friends and new friends and explore new ways of exploring resilience together at our networking last night. Hopefully you'll continue to do that today in the activities we have, whether it's the after-action review on polycrisis, the drought exercise, or really talking through how to help communities through technical assistance. Before we do that, this morning we have a couple of items to share coming from NOAA. And so the agenda this morning really sets the stage, I think, for a good conversation. We'll first hear from Dr. Mike Brennan, who's the new director of the National Hurricane Center. He'll be joining us from Miami. And then we'll also have Adam Smith, who really has the pen on understanding how the cost of natural disasters and climate-based disasters is increasing. And then we'll have a panel discussion with some key experts on what are some of the options to manage with those rising costs and those rising disasters, and then also potentially what can be done about them. Just also, we do have staff that are throughout this conference, certainly at the front desk. We did send out the app for the conference. If you haven't downloaded it now, certainly feel free to do so. We also have a number of resources through the digital swag bag that I believe was emailed to you, as well as the QR code that's floating in a couple of different areas out in the area where breakfast is currently being served. So we're about to be joined by Dr. Mike Brennan. He's the new director of NOAA's National Hurricane Center in Miami. The National Hurricane Center is a component of the National Centers for Environmental Prediction, and it's located at the Florida International University. The mission of the National Hurricane Center is to save lives, mitigate property loss, and improve economic efficiency by issuing the best watches, warnings, forecasts, and analyses of hazardous tropical weather, and by understanding these hazards. The vision is clear: to be America's calm, clear, and trusted voice in the eye of the storm, and with its partners, enable communities to be safe from tropical weather threats. So after Dr. Brennan provides his overview, we'll also be joined virtually by Adam Smith from the NOAA Centers for Environmental Information. He's the lead scientist to really study the US billion-dollar weather and climate disaster analysis. Now this report, if you have not seen it, really does provide a compelling view of the number of increasing disasters that we're facing across the United States, but also their implications for emergency managers, business continuity, and certainly whole of society. They're seeking to use this research to homogenize and transition numerous disaster data resources into a better quality control disaster cost framework. And their research has been cited in the Global Risk Report by the World Economic Forum and many, many other analyses. So we'll first hear from Dr. Brennan, and then we'll hear from Adam. Then the panel will resume after those two virtual presentations. Thanks again for your participation in the conference, for being here today. I hope that you do stick around for the exercise and for some of the other activities as we all look at helping our country and our world become more resilient.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. As just mentioned, I'm Mike Brennan. I'm the director of the National Hurricane Center and here in Miami, part of the National Weather Service. Been in this role now for a little over about 3.5 months, but I have a long history here at NHC going back about 15 years or so as a hurricane forecaster, and have dealt with many of these natural disasters and many of these billion-dollar disasters that we've just heard about, and that we'll hear about more from NCEI. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we do at the Hurricane Center, our products, and how they are used to help communities stay resilient in the face of tropical storms and hurricanes, and talk a little bit about what we're expecting for the 2023 hurricane season and some changes to a couple of our products. And then I'll finish up with a little bit of a review of fatality trends in tropical storms and hurricanes in the United States over the past 10 years or so. You just heard our mission and vision, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we are focused primarily on what I'll talk about today is our mission associated with tropical storms and hurricanes, which bring multiple hazards to both land and marine areas. But we also have a marine mission as well for forecasting for ocean-going vessels over the high seas that have a tremendous role in the blue economy and overall commerce in the United States. In our area of responsibility includes the energy industry coming in and out of the Gulf of Mexico, traffic moving through the Panama Canal across the tropical and subtropical Atlantic and Eastern Pacific. But I am going to focus on the hurricane mission today. So we are, for the United States, we try to be the clear, calm, trusted voice in the storm. We are responsible for issuing tropical storm and hurricane and storm surge watches and warnings to the United States coastline. We also have a huge international mission where we are providing forecast information to over 20 countries across the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, Bermuda, Canada, and across the Atlantic and Eastern North Pacific basins. So what our products do, we follow the storm, a tropical storm or hurricane through its entire life cycle. So we're really looking at the big picture, and we're sort of guiding that big picture forecast and messaging for a system its entire life cycle, all the way from before it's even a tropical depression through its strengthening to a tropical storm or hurricane, and then sometimes even after it's no longer a hurricane, as long as it's still threatening land areas. So our forecasts go out 5 days. We provide a track forecast, a forecast of how strong the peak winds are associated with the storm, how large is the storm's wind field, and then we really try to focus on the hazards and impacts, and I'll talk a little bit more about those hazard products in a minute. In the United States, all the local National Weather Service forecast offices across the country are using our products and downscaling that forecast information down to the community level, the county, city, municipality, regional level, where there's those protective actions are really being driven in terms of evacuations and other life safety decisions that are made by the emergency management community for the general public, but also across multiple sectors of commerce, transportation, and commercial sectors as people try to respond and keep themselves safe from tropical storms and hurricanes. But the real focus is on the hazards. And what we've moved towards over the past few years is a focus on probabilistic hazard-based products. So there are multiple hazards associated with tropical storms and hurricanes. That's what makes them such dangerous weather phenomenon. But the biggest hazard is water. So storm surge has the potential to kill the most people in a single day in tropical storms and hurricanes, like we saw tragically last year in Hurricane Ian in Southwest Florida. So we have a big focus and an increased focus on storm surge products. We have specific warnings and watches to highlight areas that are at danger of life-threatening inundation from storm surge. You can see that down here in the lower left. In the lower middle graphic, we have what we call a potential inundation map, and that is a planning tool for emergency managers and others showing a reasonable worst-case scenario of storm surge inundation above ground level associated with the hurricane that takes into account the uncertainty in the forecast, because decisions are being made 3, 4, maybe even 5 days in advance of a storm when there's significant uncertainty as to the track, the intensity, and the size. And those will all have a huge impact on the exact footprint and magnitude and location of the various hazards. We also have an increased focus on rainfall. Rainfall has been responsible for more fatalities in tropical storms and hurricanes than any other hazard in the last 10 years. So our partners at the NOAA Weather Prediction Center in the DC area are responsible for rainfall and flash flood forecasting across the United States. So we highlight their products. We also have products that look at the risk of winds. What are your risks of seeing tropical storm or hurricane force winds at a given location? And when will those winds arrive? And that timing of arrival of tropical storm force winds is a key decision point for evacuations and other preparedness activities. And again, all of these products take into account uncertainty, because that's such a key component. We know that our forecasts have errors. They're never going to be perfect. And so to provide people actionable information, we have to rely on probabilities. So what are we looking for the Atlantic hurricane season this year? This is NOAA's seasonal forecast that came out in May. There'll be an update coming out early next month. But a little more uncertainty than usual this year in the overall picture for the Atlantic basin. You can see the largest probability, 40% chances for near normal activity. So we're forecasting a range of tropical storms of about 12 to 17 5 to 9 hurricanes and 1 to 4 of those becoming major hurricanes. But you can also see there's almost an equal chance of a below or above normal season, either above or below those typical ranges. And that's due to competing factors going on in the basin that I'll talk about in just a minute. So far this season, we've had 5 named storms already. We had 1 hurricane that formed in the last week or two, Hurricane Dawn up in the North Atlantic. We haven't had any major hurricanes yet, but the bulk of the season is still to come. The vast majority of the activity in the Atlantic Basin occurs between August and October every year. So the peak of the season is very much upon us here in the next few weeks. As I mentioned, we've had 5 named storms. We had an unnamed system back in January, and we've gone through Dawn. The next named storm will be Emily in the list this year. And I talked about those competing factors. So we have very favorable conditions in the Atlantic Basin for tropical storm and hurricane activity. You've probably heard about the very warm Atlantic Ocean waters. Out in the tropical Atlantic, the sea surface temperatures, even in June, were at the levels we would normally see at the peak of hurricane season in August or September. But the competing factors on the other side is the development of El Nino in the Pacific Ocean, which tends to increase upper level winds and sinking motion across part of the deep tropics. That tends to suppress tropical storm and hurricane activity on average in the Atlantic. And so we'll see these sort of competing factors battle it out over the next weeks and months, and that will determine the overall character of the Atlantic season. However, even when we have El Nino or we have otherwise quiet, below normal hurricane seasons in terms of activity, that doesn't mean that we can't have significant hurricane impacts in the United States and elsewhere in the basin. So the main message we always provide to everyone is you have to be prepared, you have to be ready for a storm to impact you every year because that chance is there. One big issue that we're facing is short lead times. And we've seen several of these storms that have developed close to land and made landfall within 3 to 4 days within the last few years, including all the category 4 and 5 landfalls in the United States, Hurricane Ian last year, going back to category 5 Michael in 2018. These are the strongest hurricanes that have hit the United States in the past 100 years, and all of them were tropical storms 3 days before landfall. These are rapidly intensifying storms that develop close to land and then make landfall at or near their peak intensity. And this is a huge challenge for preparedness activities along the Gulf Coast and in Florida, where we tend to see these rapidly intensifying storms close to land. So this speaks to having very short timelines. You need to have that 3 to 4 day hurricane plan in place to be able to respond to a storm that develops quickly and then makes landfall at a very high intensity. Some changes we made to products for 2023. We're starting to forecast formation of tropical depressions and tropical storms out farther into the future. We've extended our tropical weather outlook product now out from 5 days into the future to 7 days. And this is sort of our daily flagship situational awareness product that's issued every 6 hours from May 15th to November 30th. It shows you the systems that the Hurricane Center is monitoring that could go on and become tropical depressions or tropical storms now over the next week. So for systems forming close to land, this can give people a little extra heads up. We've had several systems. We've got a system in the Outlook now. But again, this is the sort of day-to-day product that people check. And it's going to be your first indication that there may be an uptick in activity in the basin. We've also improved our storm surge predictions and products. We had a new version of our storm surge model was implemented into operations earlier this spring. It allows us to make real-time forecasts for 2 storms at the same time and also extend our real-time forecast information out to as much as 72 hours in advance of the onset of the hazardous conditions. We've also been able to improve storm surge products for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And we have this peak storm surge graphic here that you see on the right that we've been experimenting with for several years is now operational. And this gives you a high-level overview of the expected storm surge inundation along the immediate coastline in those highlighted areas. I want to talk quickly about fatalities. I mentioned that freshwater flooding is the biggest killer and has been the biggest killer in tropical storms and hurricanes over the last 10 years in the United States. I should note that these numbers do not include the effects of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017, but these are about 440 fatalities. Most of them are due to water in some way, shape, or form, either freshwater flooding, storm surge, or waves and rip current fatalities. Wind is responsible for about 10% or 12% of the fatalities themselves. So even though wind gets a lot of the attention, it's water that kills the most people. I want to move next to the indirect fatalities, which are largely fatalities that occur after the storm. They are not directly due to the forces of the storm itself, but would not have occurred if there hadn't been a tropical storm or hurricane. And these are largely related to long duration, large scale power outages. And these can be causes such as improper generator use causing carbon monoxide poisoning, cardiac arrest, heat related fatalities due to lack of air conditioning, issues related to lack of medical access or medical care or medical equipment, accidents that are related to preparation or recovery from the storm. And the important thing to note here is the number of indirect fatalities over the last 10 years has been just as large as the number of direct deaths. So we've really made a focus of our messaging here at the Hurricane Center and in the Weather Service, and working with our partners in the media and the emergency management community to stress that post-storm safety, to encourage people not to leave themselves in a vulnerable location after a major storm affects their area, because they may be left in an area where there's no medical or emergency services or no power. And the vast majority of these indirect deaths are associated with major hurricane landfalls. So to wrap up, I'll just leave you with a list of resources here from the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service, as well as links to our products in GIS format that many people find useful, as well as links to some hurricane preparedness information. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all this morning.
from coast to coast, impacting many lives and livelihoods, and put that into historical context. Finally, we'll wrap up talking about different disaster data tools, mapping, and other links we have. You can actually download and interact with the data itself. So the U.S. billion-dollar weather and climate disaster portfolio has been around since 1980. We update this now monthly. It used to be quarterly. But over the last 4 decades plus, we've analyzed 360 separate weather and climate disasters across the United States that in inflation-adjusted present-day dollars are $1 billion of more in total losses. Of course, this is an arbitrary threshold of $1 billion. However, it is a useful threshold because it represents 80 to 85% of the total distribution of all weather and climate-related costs at all scales and all loss levels. Here's an example. So to do this type of analysis, of course, requires a broad array of public and private sector data and partnerships. So this table shows the intersection of the 7 different core hazards at the top: hurricanes, severe storms, winter storms, cold waves, wildfire events, droughts and heat waves, and urban or river basin flood events. And the public and private sector data partners on the left. So of course, the insurance and reinsurance industry is critical. They have very valuable, important data, but also our federal agencies such as FEMA, USDA, of course, NOAA, the National Interagency Fire Center, Energy Information Administration, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and finally, state agencies and other reporting bodies after disaster. And across all these different data partners, we analyze 16 different asset classes. So that would be the total direct losses insured and uninsured for homes, businesses, government buildings like schools, all the contents of those structures, time element losses such as business interruption or loss of living quarters when you're out of your home while it's being rebuilt, damage to vehicles, boats, offshore energy platforms, military bases, and of course, public infrastructure, roads, bridges, levee systems, electrical grids, hydropower that's lost in the West due to drought. And finally, agricultural and forestry assets such as crops, livestock, commercial timber, and wildfire fighting costs. But what we do not account for is an equally important to note, which would be the non-market natural capital, environmental degradation costs, mental and physical healthcare related costs, and all downstream indirect costs such as supply chain impacts outside of the hazard region. So this is a conservative estimate, but quite comprehensive. So last year, you can see coast to coast, from the drought and the wildfire in the west to the hurricanes that really plagued Florida in the southeast, and then many of the severe convective storm events, tornado, hail, and high wind events across much of the central and eastern states. In addition to the deadly and destructive eastern Kentucky flooding in late July, and we wrapped up the year with the post-Christmas time uh, cold wave winter storm event, which really impacted Buffalo in particular. So a really dynamic year in terms of total events and also the diversity of the events. But if you roll into this year, really didn't stop. We started really late last year and went into from January through March more than 1 dozen atmospheric rivers that really plagued California. The silver lining was it really mitigated the drought impacts, but also damaged agriculture and other infrastructure out west. And you can see in the central part of the country, in the south and the southeast as well, it's been an active springtime as we typically see. And finally, the February winter storm cold wave also impacted the United States. So 12 events so far in the first 6 months that have been $1 billion or more. This chart shows over the last 43 years, complete years, the count of these billion-dollar disasters. Again, all this is inflation adjusted to present day dollars, including sub-billion-dollar events that in today's dollars are $1 billion in damage. And they're color-coded by event type, a hazard type at the top. And so the bars are the frequency, the lines are the cost. The black line is the 5-year average cost. We've had an average cost of 123.5 billion in over the last 5 years. If you look over the last 7 years, it's in excess of $1 trillion based on those asset classes I previously mentioned for these different billion-dollar disasters. But of course, this is showing our increased exposure, property in hazardous areas, our increased vulnerability, where we build and how we build, and that's important, and how we rebuild. And also climate change is driving some of these extremes that lead to billion-dollar disasters. For example, 4 out of the last 6 years, we've had historically destructive Western wildfire seasons. 2017, 2018, 2020, and 2021 were really bad. Also, the last 3 La Nina influenced years from 2020 through 2022, we've had many landfalling major hurricanes, as Mike just mentioned. And hurricanes are the most costly of these extremes that we analyze in our database. But also the blue events, those are urban city flood events or river flood events. We had more of those in the 2010s decade than we did in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s combined. So a lot of trends going in the wrong direction. Here's a chart showing the accumulation of these billion-dollar disasters throughout each of the last 43 years. The black line is the average of a 7.9 events per year, inflation adjusted. And you can see in many recent years, those are the outliers above the distribution. The red line would be 2022, in which we had 18 events. This chart perhaps is more useful. This is showing the cost accumulation from January through December, each of the last 43 years. Again, the black line is the inflation adjusted 43-year average at 57.5 billion for these billion-dollar disaster events. And I think what's interesting is looking at the distribution of events, the gray lines below and above the black average versus the real extreme outlier years, and what happened, where did it happen, why did it happen, and how can we mitigate future damages. So the purple line, the purple line was 2017 in excess of $350 billion. The blue line in second place was 2005. That was the year of Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. And then last year in 2022, we had in excess of 165 billion. That's the red line. So, we certainly have our challenges cut out for us to better manage in terms of exposure, vulnerability, and the influence and effects of climate change. Here's a map, one of many maps we have, just showing which states have had the highest total damage over the last 44 years now, 1980 through 2023. And you see Texas, Louisiana, and Florida really stand out. Their totals are there to the right in hundreds of billions of dollars. Texas and Louisiana are hit by all the extremes, whereas Florida's impacts are mostly, of course, from hurricanes. However, it goes to say that the relative costs are actually most acute in Louisiana in terms of it having a much smaller area, population, and GDP. So indeed that a lot of different regions, states, and populations are impacted increasingly by these extremes. And how to manage and rebuild from those extremes is really the question. Here's a chart showing in 2022 all of the billion-dollar disasters, each state's cost relative to that state's GDP. It doesn't surprise you that Hurricane Ian, being the costliest event of last year, really damaging from southwest to southeast Florida, was proportionally 7.5 to 10% of Florida's 2022 GDP. Pretty impactful. Also, damage you can see in the central and north central states from drought and severe storms. But the reason I show this is I want to go back several years and kind of compare the potential for compound disasters. So last year was okay for Louisiana, as you can see, but in 2021 and 2022, quite impactful for the folks in Louisiana. So you see in 2021, the GDP was about 15 to 20% of the GDP from several hurricanes and other flooding and severe storm events that impacted Louisiana. And let's go back to 2020. You can see the same thing again, more hurricanes, more severe storms. So it makes compound cascading disasters in short time space frequency, of course, makes recovery and emergency management more costly, more difficult logistically, socioeconomically. And so that's just why I wanted to point that out. Also, you can see in 2020, the historical derecho that was August 10 of 2020. It was one of the most costly thunderstorms on record, really causing a lot of billions of dollars of impact in Iowa, particularly. This chart shows of the 360 separate billion-dollar disasters from 1980 to present. You see a cumulative cost of $2.575 trillion in today's dollars. What I have circled are a couple of things. One, tropical cyclones, which are, of course, hurricanes. Those are the most costly, 1.3 trillion. Also the most costly in terms of average at 22.7. That doesn't surprise people given the exposure we have on the coast and how impactful these hurricanes are and can be. But what does surprise people is drought and heat waves. This is mostly the agricultural sector in terms of the drought cost at 334 billion, so more than a third of $1 trillion. Also has the second highest event cost average at 11.2. And the deaths would be the heat wave component to that. We're actually working with CDC and others to try to make sure we're actually capturing that effectively because there are different ways to measure indirect and direct fatalities. Another trend I'd like to quickly highlight would be in the 2010s decade, you can see circled at 957 billion, clearly head and shoulders above the other decades. Again, this is exposure plus vulnerability plus the influence of climate change. Also, we had over 5,000 fatalities with these different billion-dollar disasters. And the last 5 years, that trend just continues. So indeed, extremes are becoming a more profound part to try to understand and manage in terms of mitigating future costs, because we know these kind of extremes will continue to happen. And finally, to wrap up, this is looking at the United States in aggregate, talking basically the statistical frequency of concurrent billion-dollar disasters by month. And so you can see March, April, May, June in particular, which is, severe storm season for the eastern and 2/3 of the nation, is where you have the highest statistical likelihood based on historical record of having compound billion-dollar disaster events in the same space-time continuum and population. And as you could see back in the 1980s, of course, there's less exposure, less vulnerability, and climate change wasn't as amplified back then. We had about 82 days between these different events. Now, in the last 5 complete years, we're down to just 18 days, somewhere in the nation between have these billion-dollar disasters, which are often multi-state and regional impacting. So indeed, shorter time intervals between disasters means less time and resources available to respond, recover, and prepare for future events. And certainly the vulnerable socioeconomic populations, these types of events are most challenging for. So here are some quick links. That was a very quick, very high level overview. I'd encourage you to reach out to me. My email's at the top and explore our data. I'd be happy to talk with you in the future. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'd like to thank Rob and his team and the foundation for your leadership on this issue of importance to the business community. That the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is really pleased to partner with our foundation on this important conference. And thanks to all of you for your resilience and commitment for sticking with us on the last day of this event. Building smart, modern, resilient infrastructure is among our top priorities, and we have been among the biggest supporters of the pre-disaster mitigation policies that have been implemented across the federal government over the last several years. The idea is, how can we get the risks reduced and therefore the costs ahead of the next crisis? I want to highlight 3 observations over the last day and a half that kind of underscore these issues. So one is that more tools, more funding, and most importantly, more technical assistance is needed so communities and companies can access the resources that are out there. The second is that more policies and incentives for both companies and communities are needed to reduce these risks, and that finally, a whole of community approach is critical. If the building owner who implements hardening measures does so, and the road or the bridge still washes out, we haven't achieved our goals. So we have a very impressive panel of experts here today to focus on how we can reduce these costs. And so I'll introduce them, and then we'll have a question in response to the presentation that we just made, and then we'll dive into the discussion. So first we have Dan Kanuski, who's the Managing Director of Public Sector at Marsh McLennan. Then we have Roy Wright, who's the President and CEO of the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And finally, Romain Seguin, who is the CEO of Good 360. So wanted to ask each of you what your reaction to the information that Adam just presented. And certainly there's a significant challenge and opportunity ahead of us as we try to add up the exposure plus the climate risk and all these compounding crises. So first, we'll start with you, Roy.
Yeah, I'm always mindful when we talk about billion-dollar disasters that when it crashed through your house, you actually don't care what the cumulative cost of it was. But Americans have a particular recency bias. And if we're trying to get people to take action, this cumulative effect of what's in the news and where is it going becomes super important. I think in light of the conversations we've had here, that I so appreciate what the Chamber has done on this conversation the last 2 days, there is an element of it that plays out through the grant programs, and that's really, really important, but there will never be enough grant money to really bend down this risk. It requires investments of people's hard-earned money. Right? So there's a top 25% or so of Americans who likely could afford to take these actions. How do we nudge them and incent them to do that? How do we get businesses to take those kind of actions? It's never one or the other. And I think with much of the Chamber's leadership, we've seen tremendous progress in terms of the federal investment that is coming. We got to look at these billion-dollar events and go, okay, can we get a collective set of people who want to do something about it?
Turn to you.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. I'm Romain, and I'm at Good 360, and we are a product philanthropist. And in my previous life at UPS, I had the opportunity to live in Louisiana and Florida. And when I saw those states jump out at us, it was no surprise to me, but to having it personal, to have every human being with the disaster part, understanding it could be them, although, wherever you choose to live, that's where you live. But there's so much we can do to get prepared to mitigate the cost. Currently, we're 2 months ahead, when I say we, Good 360's disaster recovery department, of procuring products and pre-staging goods that will be needed. Because we can't think, well, we'll wait until it happens. We know it's going to happen with the data. I think there's going to be a lot of movement with artificial intelligence to even give us better insight of where we can get the funding, where we can get the product. How can we support certain geographic parts of the United States? And I want to close on The first like 7, 8 days of a disaster, everyone's there. Everyone's there. The news is there, everyone's there. But then it goes 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months, and people are still displaced. They don't have a house to live in. They don't have a bed to sleep in. And that's where we really see our strength is the stages of a disaster, and can collectively, we can support all stages together to start mitigating some of that expense.
Finally, Dan?
Well, I certainly agree, and as someone who's been part, lucky or not, of a number of billion-dollar disasters, and having sat both in government during Hurricanes Katrina and Maria, and seeing really the devastating consequences, which really inspired me from the government perspective to do something about it, and that's why FEMA has the focus on resilience that it does today. That's going to help move the needle, but as Roy said, the government alone can't solve this problem. I think it will take incentives. It'll take incentives for individuals, as Roy said, but it'll also take incentives from a policy standpoint or incentives from other industries. And what I mean by that is, so from the federal standpoint, a strong incentive to build resilience is a federal grant. That requires an appropriation of funding, and luckily, there's a ton of funding out there, BRIC and other programs. But that incentive, that 2.0 version, would be something akin to, I would say, community disaster resilience zones, or CDRZs. Again, is that a federal program? Yes, but it's meant to incentivize behavior as opposed to just appropriating more and more money. And FEMA actually has additional authorities that it could implement if it chose to. So one of those is to move the federal cost share from 75% up to 85% if that community did the right thing before the disaster. And the right thing, it's all the stuff we're talking about, right? It's hazard mitigation, it's insurance. So I call on FEMA to implement that program, to incentivize that good behavior. And those of us in the insurance industry, or any industry that you represent, we need to see ourselves as risk managers, right? We are there to help people manage their risk. The same way that we did as emergency managers, we need to be doing in the private sector.
Really important point, and Cedars increases the cost share from 75 up to 90% for some of those most vulnerable communities. So, and another important opportunity. So, Roy, turning to you and indicating through your organization's research that mitigated structures perform better in severe weather than otherwise, how can we persuade homeowners and business owners to take action on a sunny day through retrofitting and other actions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think this is critical. So IVHS, in a nutshell, we crash test houses against Mother Nature. Hurricane, flood, hail, wildfire, everything at full scale. And that then feeds a number of different streams. We do quite a bit towards building codes and what does it look like to know how to build better so that we can withstand what's coming. But 99% of Americans live in places that were built 5 or more years ago. We've got to look at the retrofit side of the equation. We know how to construct to withstand 135-mile-an-hour winds. We know what to do to properties to narrow the likelihood of ember ignition in wildfire zones. Many of those actions are things that would cost somewhere between $3,000 and $10,000. But it fundamentally changes the outcome on the other side. And so how do we get folks to this point, Chuck? I think that this is a place where we are learning and leaning in because the science can be clear, but the behavioral economics to get someone to do it is difficult. I'll be honest with you, sometimes I have trouble getting federal agencies and state entities to take what's known in the science and act on it. And so we need to put some incentives in place, particularly for those who have the ability to pay. If you don't have the ability to pay, I think the grant programs are the lane, but what does it look like to take something similar to the energy efficiency tax credits, by which homeowners can make those investments, so they can see the pathway? Because too often folks go, well, if I take the action, I just want a one-for-one payback in my insurance premiums, and I want it inside of 3 years. Well, you should get a price consideration, but I don't know that you'll see it play out. Well, my $3,000 paid, I want it back, and I want it back now. To your point, Romaine, it was this piece that goes, there is a financial side, but remember when it comes to disasters, there is the disruption of your life and the displacement of your family. You can't put dollar values on that. And so I think we've got to find ways collectively to show people the way and give them the nudges. We can show you what to do for the wildfire. We can show you what to do on the roof. We can show you what to do related to severe convective storms and hurricane dimensions. We now need to be able to push through and get people to take actions as opposed to just explain it away and go, it won't happen to me. I hope it won't happen to me. You'll make sure it doesn't happen to me, right? And I think that's the place where too many Americans sit today. And as a result, they live really in the backlash of what we see behind us here, which is billion-dollar disaster after billion-dollar disaster.
Yeah. Really important point, and at the Chamber, as you know, we like carrots more than sticks, so we appreciate that perspective. Romaine, wanted to turn to you with your expertise at UPS on supply chains. How can we reduce the cost of getting products to communities when a disaster happens?
Well, I think Roy hit on a perfect point. A sunny day. I was talking with our disaster recovery team, I believe it was Monday or Tuesday, and it was a perfect day, and I go, this is when we should start talking about disaster recoveries. What do we need to do to prepare ourselves? So if there is an issue in the supply chain, we can build resilience against it if we have pre-staged product that folks will need during a disaster, whether it's a tornado, whether it's a hurricane. Obviously, we're going into the height of our hurricane season. But I like what you said, Roy. Hope. You can't plan on hope. You can't execute on hope. You can't fix families on hope. And the reality is, we're going to have disasters. People don't like talking about them. People don't like talking about there's going to be hurricanes this year. You know, people in Louisiana's like, oh, I hope it hits Florida. People in Florida's like, oh, I hope it. I mean, seriously, I've lived it, and that's no way to live. That it's going to be right. It's going to happen. So how do we get prepared? Right now, we're looking at staging some warehousing needs in southern Atlanta, where we can feed logistically and not have a supply chain interruption needed goods when a disaster does happen in one of those two states. So what we're doing is working with our wonderful donors and saying, hey, this is what we're working with state agencies. This is our need. This is what they're saying they'll need during a hurricane. And that's where the corporations come in. I think individuals are so powerful too, but we really work with our corporate donors to pre-stage needed product, needed goods, whether it's necessities to stay alive the first 7 days and then to get in your home 6 months from now. So I just think it's really planning. Plan ahead, whether it's storage, whether it's funding. I love your point, retrofitting. I mean, how many, is there a plan that we can retrofit in this community 20,000 houses? 30,000 houses. You look at the cost of it, whether you bump it up to 30,000, just do the math. We're still ahead.
It is, and that for me really is so powerful there is you're not stopping the hurricane from happening, you're narrowing its path of destruction. You're not stopping the wildfire, you're narrowing the path of destruction.
Absolutely, and I think the more strategic that we can get together, and whether we go to a corporation, whether we go to a community, and source the funding to do exactly what we're all talking about on stage.
Appreciate that. So everyone has seen the recent reports of different insurers making decisions based on risks that have filled the headlines over the last couple of months. Dan, can you help us cut through the news clutter and understand those dynamics at play?
Sure, happy to take that question. Thanks. So again, if we're all considered risk managers, we need to look at the underlying risk. Insurance is just pricing the underlying risk, right? And so, one, and two, we can't look at any one state and extrapolate that to the rest of the states. The reason being, insurance is regulated at the state level. I don't want to get into the market dynamics or regulatory environment in any particular state. But two, as part of that, the hazard is different in every state, right?
Yes.
Some states are more hazard prone than others, and the hazard one state faces is very different than another. So for me, as I look at this, as I mentioned at the top of my remarks, some of the federal policies that would encourage good behavior, I think that there's more that we in the insurance industry could be doing. And in the same way that as an emergency manager, we should be using every tool in the toolbox, as those of us in the insurance industry, we too should be using every tool in the toolbox. One of those tools that I think is not as well understood and deserves more attention are those types of insurance that fall under alternative risk transfer. It's just a fancy way of saying doing insurance a different way. One of those different ways is parametric insurance. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I doubt many people know what parametric insurance is. And that's a problem, because parametric insurance, which is essentially paying out after a specific event happens, makes complete sense, right? Well, how's that different than traditional insurance? Traditional insurance, there has to be a loss. Traditional insurance, there has to be a damage assessment, to use emergency management term, or insurance adjuster, to use an insurance term. With parametric insurance, that's not the case. If a specific event happens, let's say a hurricane, and it happens in this geography, and that is what we all agreed ahead of time. If X happens, we pay Y. That payment comes immediately, and there's no need for doing insurance adjusting or damage assessments, and that can cover an entire community. So that alternative risk transfer, in this case parametric insurance, you say, okay, that sounds great, but does it, in theory, but does it work in practice? Well, frankly, I wanted to know the answer to that question as much as you did, so we're running a pilot right now in the city of New York. Together with the city, along with the largest global reinsurer, a technology company, and a nonprofit, we're working with a low to moderate income community in Lower Manhattan and providing them a level of protection against the risk they face, the risk that they were worried about, flood. And so that community will today, thanks to a grant from the National Science Foundation, receive an immediate cash payment if that event occurs. In other words, if those neighborhoods flood, they will receive an immediate cash payment. Now, that's in addition to whatever they might get from FEMA, because again, this is a community that's largely uninsured, especially with flood insurance, right? These underserved communities, they generally don't have renters or homeowners insurance, much less flood. But a solution like this that we brand as community-based catastrophe insurance, we believe can make a real difference and can help close the gap between those who are insured and those who are uninsured.
Dan, maybe you can build on that and talk a little bit about what the policy levers need to be in order to get the insurance sector moving in that direction and then get communities on board with that kind of approach.
And I hate to say it in a negative way, but there are disincentives built into the system. Right now, whether you're a government and eligible for what we call public assistance under the FEMA programs, or you're an individual that might qualify for individual assistance under those programs, PA and IA, in short, while they might seem like great programs, in fact, they're programs that might be necessary as a safety net program for those that don't have insurance, they're building in this disincentive into the system where those communities and those individuals are not incentivized to do the right thing, to get insurance before a disaster happens, or to invest in hazard mitigation to reduce their risk profile, because they know that if there is a presidentially declared disaster, they're going to get federal funding. In other words, the taxpayers are paying for those losses rather than the individual, the community, or a collective entity that could be coming together and reducing that risk through risk reduction measures, through insurance, through a number of different ways.
Really important. I guess I would throw it out to the group on a broader discussion of the notion of policy incentives. For instance, Romain, in supply chains, how do we get pre-disaster mitigation to be the primary approach as supply chains build resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we approach it and lay the plan out on how to mitigate the supply chain hiccups in it, especially during a disaster, a lot of people don't understand that. And the power of explaining it, that's where we come into the situation of, if we pre-stage the product now and mitigate the hiccups in the supply chain, we can get much ahead of this when victims are in need of product.
I think it's a really crucial piece on that. We talk about, how do you build back better? And I don't mean that with the capital B's, but just small b's in that kind of space. We watch after a disaster, so many roofs that have to be replaced. And there's some simple things when you're doing that make them more resilient. You seal the roof deck, you don't deal with water intrusion in the future. And all too often, the very supplies that are necessary to do those actions are not available.
Yeah. Yep.
And the homeowner says, well, I'll take whatever you have, just put something back on my roof.
And
I want my home
right.
back. Yet we know that these are pieces. GF was here. They make one of these products yesterday. We were talking about these elements that goes, do we have those simple pieces? Which, for the record, it's a roofing tape. Right? It's not a big thing. It's a set of roofing tape. Yet in hurricane-prone areas right after the disasters,
you don't have it.
We don't have it.
Nope.
And we don't have the workforces often who swoop in right after knowing where to get those pieces. And so you talk about pre-disaster mitigation. Sometimes the pre-disaster mitigation is really about making sure that near-term recovery and repair frame has the availability that logistics have played out. The supply chain has it sitting there.
Exactly.
Otherwise, they're like, well, I got my roof back on. Well, it's not as good as it should be. I got a roof. I just need my life back.
But Roy, the pre-staging and knowing, working with the experts in the industry, whether it's roofing, whether it's drywall, I mean, name what happens in an event. Working with the experts on what products do you need immediately to get the roof fixed? What products do you need immediately to get some of the foundation through a tornado? And those things can be sourced. And there are very good donors if we strategically lay out, this is what's needed. I'm very confident they will donate, and then we stage it, and then we're prepared.
Roy, you talked a little bit about how you crash test houses and that building codes are an important part of that. What's the latest research on how the building code space needs to be improved?
Yeah, so the United States has the best building codes available in the world. We set lead the conversation on international standards. Of the jurisdictions across the United States, only 35% of jurisdictions have codes in place being enforced. We, the United States, are smarter than everyone else about this, yet 2/3 of our population live in places by which we know how to do better, and we make a very near-term financial decision that says, I want it just a bit cheaper. It's pretty discouraging to me, I'll be honest with you. So the last state to join the statewide building code piece was in 2008 when Louisiana joined. We're watching North Carolina try to roll their pieces back right now. We go into the middle of the country, and some good stuff happened in the legislation for FEMA to incent people to move towards building codes. And everyone's trying to water it down, and FEMA's trying to find ways to go, well, I know it's really hard to have a code in your state, so we won't hold you accountable for that. But after the disaster, which could have been narrowed in terms of its impact, they want all their bills paid. They want other taxpayers to send them the money for them to recover. We've got to lean in harder in this space. I do think the builder and developer community is taking these pieces. I think you watch the heat dome effects in the Southwest right now, and they are building from an energy efficiency way in Phoenix because they have to be able to stand 115-degree heat. But even when I go to California, who has some of the best pieces on wildfire codes, the communities one by one go, yeah, that's the right thing to do, but can we draw the map so that not all of town needs to build this way? Well, we went back into the analysis. So how much additional does it cost in the California context to do this? It's adding about $3,000 to the price of a $600,000 construction project. Wow. Like, nope, please don't apply this here. And so as clear cut as it is about how to build to withstand wind and storms, to narrow the impact of wildfire pieces, even to build higher and stronger from a flood perspective, near-term decision-making leads us astray. And I think that we're on pace for some of these big events to get lined up with some debt crisis in Congress where someone's wondering, why do we keep paying for this? And
Exactly.
is that the point where we're going to finally go, you got to move forward and use what we know. Don't make this worse.
I think Roy hits on a very critical topic, is the data. Data does not lie. It doesn't. And and there's so much data out there. If we can educate, whether it's our government, whether it's the local officials, we can just be smarter about how to handle disasters. I don't know if it's we're afraid of data. I don't know if it forces us to really look in the mirror because here's the facts and we have to make a decision. But I will applaud you to keep pushing the data.
I'll pull that string, if I could, back to what you asked Dan just a little bit earlier. Risk has a price. There's a set of people right now who aren't excited about the price of their property insurance. If they were built in a way to minimize it, I think the industry meets that with a price consideration.
Yeah, I mean, it's price based on risk.
Right.
You're 100% right. There's one thing you take away from this. And I will say, the data, we need to have access to the data, and then we need to show people what that means.
Exactly.
And so I would say, so everyone's heard back in my FEMA days, I would always highlight the 6-to-1 number, right? Because I thought that really resonated, especially with emergency managers. Every $1 invested in hazard mitigation saves $6 when a disaster occurs. And I'm proud to now be affiliated with the National Institute of Building Sciences, who came up with that number and did the analysis. I see JQ back here. But let's take it that step further. Building codes. We know what the ROI is on building codes, but we need to do a better job of educating everyone what that ROI is. In fact, it's about 11-to-1, right? You go to a higher level building code from where you are to a disaster resilient building code, you could see an 11-to-1 benefit cost, which is amazing. We need to do better advocating for this as well. We take that great data, we take the analysis, and we advocate for it. Natalie Anklade, I see here from Build Strong Coalition, they advocate for strong building codes. Again, we need more of that. Chuck, this conference, perfect example, us talking about this, you advancing this on the Hill as you do every day. Rob Glenn here at the Chamber, advancing these issues is so critically important. And so the bottom line for me is none of us can do this on our own. We need to do this together, whether it's groups that I'm part of with the insurers and the real estate developers and the lenders. We realize we need to work together. Again, that's something NIBS is doing with the Committee on Finance, Insurance, and Real Estate. And I know I see both of you all around also advocating and working with each of you in your industry associations to advocate, to educate on these important resilience investments.
So we have just a few minutes left, so maybe we'll do a rapid fire, this notion of the economics of resilience. What does it look like? What are the costs and reduce risk that we can put out there? So this is the public-private partnership conference. So I guess 2 quick questions. What's the partnerships that we need to see in order to advance this? And the second thing, is there a policy that we haven't talked about already? If you were to be aspirational, what are the things that we need to get out there to solve these issues?
From a partnership perspective, I would just say we'd love to work with our private sector on what we need by state and strategically source with you. Some of our donors have a lot of product they need to repurpose. We can take that. Some of our donors strategically want to donate for the effort of a disaster. So really, that's where we see our role, is getting ahead of it. But again, I like these 2 guys that mitigate the risk of us having to be there. I mean, we're at the tail end of it, y'all. And we come in after the event happens. And we're helping the communities, we're helping the families, but can we mitigate the amount of people we have to aid and assist
I think
with
that's
help.
so-
I mean, we're the tail end of it.
Romaine's organization will always be necessary. The disaster is going to happen. Can we narrow it?
Yes.
Chuck, I'd reference the point that I did just briefly earlier. When we can find market forces to nudge people in the right direction, we make far more progress. You create an engine and a flywheel in that space. Insurance will find a way to price the risk, and there's no greater risk communication tool than a pricing signal. But I do think that we've got to find ways to get those kind of tax incentives in place
Absolutely.
at the individual and at the corporate level so that there is incentive. Cedars does some of that potentially at the corporate level if the second wave of that comes together in terms of what does it mean to put capital investment in play. But if we could show someone the carrot and says, make this investment, you're going to narrow the impact, you're going to be able to withstand that storm and come home, and here's the consideration that may play out in terms of some kind of tax credit, I think we make far more progress.
Absolutely.
Ben, the last word.
Carrots, not sticks.
Excellent. Well, please join me in a warm round of applause for our experts, and we really appreciate the opportunity. Excellent.
Okay, so I guess now's the time to start saying thank you to a lot of people, and including all of you. We really do hope that the agenda that we've assembled has informed, challenged, and inspired all of you to reduce the impacts of disasters and build resilience. You know, the sense of urgency that we really do carry into response does need to be felt through all the other phases of a crisis and a disaster. We need to carry that sense of urgency, that fire within us towards building resilience, towards looking at smarter ways to recover. We just heard many different options around how we could potentially do that. We at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation carry that with us as well to strengthen the business network for this cause, being ready for what's next and anticipating what's next, and effectively mobilizing against it before, during, and after disaster. Many of you have traveled a long way to be here, and we're very thankful for that. Some of you just came across the river. We're thankful for that as well. Please reach out to us if you're interested in working with us. And I know that I've stopped by, talked to many of you. I can't talk to everybody, but if you email resilience@uschamber.com or just stop by the registration desk, if you've got some ideas to follow up on, we do want to hear them. And we certainly will be asking feedback in the post-conference survey, so just please take a couple moments to figure it out. We actually do listen to the feedback. So we did design this conference this year based upon the feedback from last year. So a couple of things that I'll reflect on very quickly. We wanted more opportunities for breakouts separate from the main conduct of the conference. That's why the plenary yesterday had a brief working lunch, and then why the bulk of the activity today after this is all focused on interaction. And the collaborative nature of a catastrophic drought exercise, something that probably most of us have not really ever been part of, is an example of that. And that's going to be held in the Great Hall here at 10:30. We'll also be conducting an after-action review, comparing notes about what life is like now, a couple of years after the pandemic, even though COVID-19 still exists in the world. That's going to be held in the Lee Anderson Veterans Center, also at 10:30. And then we're also going to be looking at building on some of the concepts that were just discussed with Chuck, identifying opportunities for technical assistance at the local level. That's in meeting room 3 and 4. And then after lunch, We're going to have a buffet lunch out in the lounge. And we'll have the second part of the exercise, as well as the ability to provide feedback on FEMA's resilience guidance that's being developed, and that also will be in Lee Anderson. Just really want to thank all of you, but also our panelists, our moderators, and experts that have hopefully enlightened all of us on the state of where we are today. And also certainly would like to thank our federal partners, DHS, CISA, FEMA, NOAA, the SBA, and USAID for their support in helping us bring these important conversations to you. This event will also not be possible without our SHAPE leaders and sponsors who support our disaster response and resilience work at the Foundation. So we're very thankful. I think this is in alphabetical order to Abbott, Amazon, AmerisourceBergen, Copperleaf Technologies, the Coca-Cola Company, Duke Energy, FedEx, JetBlue, the Medtronic Foundation, Procter & Gamble, Prudential, the Resiliency Initiative, Shell, UPS, and the UPS Foundation. All of you have stepped forward to take action as our world becomes more challenging to live in. Thank you for advancing resilience today for the complexity of tomorrow. We really do go farther together, and we're really thankful for you being here today, and hopefully see you back in one of those activities at 10:30. So thanks for your time, and look forward to the interaction this afternoon and the bulk of this morning. Thanks.